I'm Elaine Quijano. It's good to be with you. Thanks for joining us. Public health officials are concerned about the latest wave of COVID-19 infections coming from the highly contagious Omicron variant. President Biden spoke from the White House about his administration's plan to respond to the ever-changing virus this winter. His proposal includes opening more vaccination sites, deploying doctors to hot spots, and making more at-home rapid tests available. Here's some of what he said during his speech.
We should all be concerned about Omicron, but not panicked. If you're fully vaccinated, and especially if you got your booster shot, you are highly protected. And if you're unvaccinated, you're at a higher risk of getting severely ill from COVID-19, getting hospitalized, and even dying.
Meanwhile, the president's social and climate spending bill suffered a major setback after West Virginia Senator Joe Manchin pulled out of negotiations. And though Democrats accuse him of single-handedly killing the president's signature legislative item, we're now learning the senator actually offered a similarly priced counteroffer to the White House just before the very public split. Democratic leaders are now looking for a way to salvage the bill in the coming weeks after Congress's winter recess. On the international front, Russia is deploying troops at an accelerating pace. President Putin is claiming American and European aggression has led him to mobilize military assets along a shared border with Ukraine. CBS News Chief Foreign Affairs correspondent Margaret Brennan asked Vice President Harris about how the U.S. is prepared to react.
We are very clear that Russia should not invade the sovereignty of Ukraine, that we must stand up, and we are standing up for its territorial integrity. We are working with our allies in that regard, and we've been very clear that we are prepared to issue sanctions like you've not seen before.
Does that mean sanctioning Vladimir Putin directly?
I am not going to talk about specific sanctions, but we are making that clear to him, and we are in direct conversations.
For more, I want to bring in Nikole Killion, Steve Dorsey, and Philip Bump. Nikole is a CBS News congressional correspondent. Steve is a CBS News correspondent. And Philip is a national correspondent for The Washington Post and author of the newsletter, How to Read This Chart. Welcome. It's good to have you all. Steve, let me start with you. The White House announced today that it will make 500 million at-home rapid COVID tests available in the new year. What other assets is the administration mobilizing in response to the Omicron variant?
Well, the free tests were really the highlight of his remarks, something that public health officials have been calling on for weeks. But the president also said his administration is going to pledge more support for hospitals in states like New York that are overwhelmed right now. They're also going to expand the stockpile of things like PPE. They're going to send more federal medical personnel to hard-hit cities and regions, and they're going to make more of these federally supported testing sites available, including using Google to help folks find the one closest to them.
You know, Steve, I wonder, I listened to a little bit of the briefing and then, of course, watched the president's remarks. What can you tell us about what the White House is saying regarding why these tests weren't made available sooner to the American public?
You know, the best explanation we've been getting from the White House is that they really didn't expect the surge of Omicron to happen so quickly. We heard that admission, that defense from President Biden today, because just weeks ago, a reporter at the White House briefing asked White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki, why isn't the administration sending out these tests like other countries, including the UK, do for free for their citizens? And she mocked that reporter, saying that it would be unfeasible to send a test to every American that wants.
Yeah, and it was something that she obviously, in hindsight, today at that briefing, you know, it struck a very different tone. Speaking of which, Philip, when I was listening to the president today, I could not help but think about the tone and tenor of his remarks on COVID right around July 4th. And I want to go ahead and play some of that for our viewers now.
245 years ago, we declared our independence from a distant king. Today, we are closer than ever to declaring our independence from a deadly virus. That's not to say the battle against COVID-19 is over. We've got a lot more work to do.
All right, so Philip, how has the administration changed its messaging on COVID since then? And what does this sort of evolving nature of the virus and the science itself really suggest about how much of a challenge this has been with respect to messaging for the White House?
Yeah, I mean, from the outset, the Biden administration really put a heavy emphasis on vaccination as the way out of the pandemic. They've been trying for months to try and push numbers higher. They're aiming to get to, if I remember correctly, 70% vaccination by that July 4th mark, which they did not get to. Right. And after that point, vaccinations really started to stall out. We saw increased partisan response to vaccination, with Republicans being less likely to actually get vaccinated than Democrats. And one of the effects of that was that it overlapped with the emergence of the Delta variant. And so the Delta variant led to a big spike in a number of southern states in particular over the course of the summer. One of the things we've seen repeatedly is that the administration keeps finding itself having to deal with new surges for which it does not appear to be prepared, as is the case with the Omicron variant. And so now it finds itself in a position of this thing is surging, that it is making up a high composition of the new cases that are being detected, and now is trying to play catch up once again with its initial strategy of get everyone vaccinated right out of the gates, having basically fallen apart, or at least not lived up to the expectations that Biden once had.
All right, well, Nikole, Democrats are back to the drawing board on the president's social spending plan. What's next?
Well, Senate Democrats are going to put their heads together this evening. They are meeting, and they're going to do it virtually, where they will try to figure out a path forward, not just on the president's Build Back Better agenda, but also with respect to voting rights. So, typically when they are in session, they have these weekly caucus meetings. But again, this time they are doing it virtually. And the hope is that they can come out of it with some type of next steps. But Leader Schumer has made pretty clear that he is not giving this up without a fight, that he does intend to bring up this Build Back Better legislation when the Senate reconvenes next year, because he believes each senator should stake their position on this, not just in a television interview, as Senator Manchin did, but, make their position known on the floor with a vote. Democrats do intend to keep pushing towards this legislation and trying to get it back on the drawing board. We heard from President Biden earlier today saying that he does intend to get something done with Senator Manchin. So certainly between now and the time the Senate comes back, I can only imagine there will be quite a bit of arm twisting going on, not only within the Senate Democratic caucus, but also between the White House and Senator Manchin.
Steve, following up on Nicole's point, what is the White House saying about the president's potential involvement in negotiations on his social and climate bill in the days ahead?
Well, we heard from the president himself tell reporters today that he has a good relationship with Manchin. He's optimistic, as always. We've seen over the last few months that he'll get a deal done with Manchin. And this all runs parallel to what's going on, as Nikole described, in Congress, to try to get something done. But remember, even if President Biden does secure a deal with Manchin, there is a risk that he could alienate some progressives who want something expansive, who want an ambitious plan to fight climate change and support struggling Americans. So that could turn them off as well.
Well, Philip, the Washington Post reports Senator Manchin gave the White House a considerable counteroffer to the president's bill, but they balked. What were the main sticking points?
Well, it looks like the primary sticking point was that Manchin's proposal did not include the child tax credit, which has been a very fundamental part of what President Biden's been advocating for essentially since he took office. There have been a lot of rumors about ways in which Manchin might have been unhappy with the legislation otherwise, but it seems like a lot of what President Biden wanted to see affected was actually in Manchin's counterproposal. So there's been a lot of call from people who are Democrats over the course of the past day or two for Biden to simply make that deal, to actually reach out to Manchin and accept Manchin's terms. I mean, look, at the end of the day, Joe Manchin is the 50th vote on this. And yes, there are, of course, 50 Republicans who, could potentially vote for this if they wanted to. But obviously, Joe Manchin, a Democrat, is a lot more likely to than are those Republicans. And if this is the deal that he's making, then there are increasingly calls for President Biden to accept the terms of Manchin's deal.
Yeah, Nikole, help us understand just a bit more. I don't want to get too in the weeds, but when it comes to the child tax credit, what is the root of that opposition from Senator Manchin for including that?
Well, it's a couple of things. I mean, Senator Manchin has made clear, broadly speaking, in terms of the package, that he doesn't want this to turn into a massive entitlement program, whether it's a child tax credit or any other things that have been proposed in this package. So he is someone who supports means testing and kind of wants some requirements attached to some of these benefits. And even CBS News has learned that, one of his private concerns that he expressed to some of his Senate colleagues is that he was concerned people may abuse, for instance, these child tax credit payments, perhaps potentially to pay for drugs. And so that is something that, again, he privately expressed concerns about, although his office has pushed back against that, saying that, the senator has always supported this child tax credit. And that's what he has insisted with reporters when asked about it. There have been questions about whether or not there should be just a one-year extension of this program, because keep in mind, families have been receiving these payments for the last couple of months. And so there had been talk about extending it maybe for a year. That was part of the House proposal. But Senator Manchin seemed to think that maybe it should be extended for 10 years. But in order to do that, that would inflate the cost. And so you kind of have to have some type of trade-off. So that is part of the rationale as to why perhaps there was this discussion about maybe getting that child tax credit out of the bill, because it simply would hike up the price of the package if it were to span for a full 10 years.
Well, switching gears, Nikole, the House committee investigating the January 6th Capitol insurrection made a request, not a subpoena, to interview Congressman Scott Perry, who promptly denied that request. What do we know, Nikole, about the Pennsylvania Republican and his relationship with former President Trump?
Well, what the committee alleges here, they say that they have a lot of evidence from multiple witnesses that Pennsylvania Congressman Scott Perry was involved in these attempted efforts to try to install former Department of Justice official Jeffrey Clark as the acting attorney general. That is something that the former president considered at one point, but ultimately never acted on, in part because, part of the rationale in potentially elevating Clark was that he was a loyalist of the president and supported some of his views in terms of pursuing some of these false claims about the election. And so he, was kind of willing to do the former president's bidding to try to, come to some resolutions. And so consequently, you have Scott Perry, who again may have been involved in these attempts at the time to try to install him in place. Additionally, the committee says that there are text messages that Perry allegedly has with former White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows, and that also they believe that he also communicated with the White House on a number of issues, including voting machines that he felt were corrupt. So that is why they want to talk to him, and this is something that is voluntary. They have asked him to come before the panel either at the end of this month or early next year, but Congressman Perry did issue a statement saying that he is going to decline that request at this time, that he believes the committee is illegitimate, that he stands by the rule of the Constitution. Well, the committee has since shot back, saying that, in their view, they want people to cooperate willingly, but even if it's a member of Congress who chooses not to, then they will potentially look to other tools to try to extract the information that they need.
Well, Steve, Russian President Vladimir Putin is blaming the West for tensions since the end of the Cold War. What has happened with U.S.-Russia negotiations since that call between him and President Biden earlier this month?
Well, behind the scenes, they've kind of picked up a bit more steam. It seems like officials here in Washington and in Moscow are trying to set the stage for some kind of in-person talks at some point in the new year. NATO officials, they've already said they're going to work to talk to their counterparts in Russia in the new year. Our reporter, Felix Light in Moscow, says this is a story that's gaining a lot of traction in Moscow. So Moscow is now very interested in talking with the U.S. There's a lot at stake here, mainly global stability, right? Because the reason why NATO and Washington are so concerned with us right now is this massive Russian troop buildup we've been hearing about for weeks now along the Ukrainian-Russian border. Russia says it's just preparing for defensive measures in case the West, NATO, the U.S., Ukraine take measures on their doorstep. And now it appears that both sides are willing to find ways, publicly at least, to try to find inroads to have conversations.
And finally, Philip, former President Trump was booed for announcing on his and Bill O'Reilly's history tour that he had received a COVID-19 booster shot. It was interesting to hear President Biden say today that that was, quote, maybe one of the few things he and I agree on. And President Biden also credited the prior administration, he said, and our scientific community on vaccines. But you wrote, Philip, about the conflict between the former president's supporters and COVID messaging. Tell us more about that.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, we've sort of seen this remarkable detente over the course of the past 24 hours or so between President Biden and former President Trump on this issue of vaccination. Trump made these comments yesterday, or made the comments, I believe it was actually over the weekend, about how the vaccine program actually can be seen as a success by him and his base, something they worked on, and that by objecting to vaccination, they were essentially depriving themselves of a win, if you will. The challenge, of course, is that Donald Trump rose to power in the Republican Party on the back of this idea that elites can't be trusted, that the government is not something that people should feel confident in. And that was something that he exploited last year. As the pandemic got underway, he really leaned into this idea that actually the pandemic was not a big deal. Don't listen to Anthony Fauci. Don't listen to these experts who were saying that you should wear a mask and yada, yada, yada. Get back to normal. The reason he was saying that, of course, was to a significant extent because he was worried about re-election. He didn't want the economy to take a hit. But the problem was that he'd been for years leveraging this idea that elites and experts should not be trusted, that you can trust your own gut on issues like this, and then reinforce that very directly and specifically on these issues related to the coronavirus. So once he actually, in the final weeks of his presidency, when he had already lost the election, but the vaccines were starting to be rolled out, he was in this weird spot where he wanted to take the credit. He wanted to get the credit for these vaccines having been rolled out as quickly as they were. Biden, of course, gave him that credit today. But at the same time, he'd already inculcated this sense in his base and really fostered the sense that you couldn't trust what the experts were saying. And that provided an opportunity for a lot of other people to continue to play off of that idea, to continue to say that the elites can't be trusted, experts can't be trusted, like Fox News today was making a similar claim. And that, I think, has been a much more powerful message in the same way that it propelled Trump back in 2015, 2016. And now it's limiting his ability to actually get his supporters to go out and get vaccinated.
Right, because, Philip, it was interesting the way you kind of, I'm paraphrasing what you wrote here, but the way you kind of outlined it in your piece, you talked about essentially Trumpism itself being a bit of a more powerful force than necessarily the instinct to support the individual here, Donald J. Trump himself.
Yeah, and when I say Trumpism, I'm referring exactly to that sentiment, that what you hear in conservative media is accurate, and all the elites are out to get you, and that they're trying to tamp down on your cultural values and things along those lines. That sort of message and that way of looking at the world is something that brought Donald Trump to the forefront in the Republican primary in 2015, 2016, and he was able to leverage that as president to keep his base loyal, to say you can't trust these elites, yada yada yada. But now then we come to this point at which trusting expertise on this one particular issue is literally a matter of life and death, and that people are dying because they're not getting vaccinated, and yet they are still more prone to believe this idea that the government can't be trusted, that the elites shouldn't be listened to, that there must be something wrong with the vaccine, and or there must be something good about things like ivermectin, which they should rely on instead. And Donald Trump really fostered that sense, and now it's really limiting his ability to be able to be who he wants to be, which is the guy that can take credit for the vaccines that saved America.
Right. Interestingly, as we said, he got booed for acknowledging that he had received that booster shot. All right, Nikole, Steve, and Philip, really great to have you all. Thanks very much.